Seth, sometimes your face gets white. I don't know.
Yeah, whiteness is a great mystery in our society. I don't know what that is that causes those flares, because it's already dark out. So the
Huh.
So,
Blanca, who is the real Blanca? Which one are you? Are you the one with the picture? Yeah, you are, with the banner.
I'm seeing all kinds of people I know and miss and are fantastic.
I know, Nicolette.
Yeah, Nicolette.
Gloria's here.
Wonderful.
Elaine's sister.
If folks who are coming on notice that their name is unaccountably Blanca Rodriguez, and you want to change your name to your actual name, go to the top right of your screen where there are the three little dots, and click on the three little dots, and go down to rename and type your correct name in. Blanca very nicely sent out a link so that in case anybody lost their link at the last second, they could for sure join the conference anyway. The downside of that is that we have lots of Blanca Rodriguez's, which I find really seriously charming. But those who want to rename themselves can do it easily with those three little dots.
Susan's here. Hi, Susan.
So strange. I just updated my Zoom and all of my like virtual backgrounds disappeared. My name, it's really weird.
That's a nuisance.
There's a brand new, I guess, update out.
Yep, same thing happened to me. My virtual backgrounds all disappeared.
It's a first. So you had to reload everything.
I think we can take the banner down now and just have the gallery view where folks can see each other.
Oh, God.
There's Billy.
Hey, Akua, it's Rennie. Hi.
Hi, Rennie. So good to see you.
Hi, Jane. You're muted. Hi, Marjolaine.
Hi, Sheila. Hi, Seth.
The red.
Yeah. Hi, Sheila.
Hi.
Miss you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do I, can I unmute? Can I mute myself?
Yes.
Where?
You go down to there. Go down to the bottom left.
Hi, Bettina.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thanks.
Happy to see you.
Good to see you too, thanks.
Thank you.
Everybody, we're still here.
Yeah. You want to mute?
Yeah, I want to mute.
Yeah.
Well, it's 3:30 and I am looking at rows and rows of little boxed friends whom I dearly love and colleagues from many years and people who were shaped by and who loved Helene and who come together to celebrate. Helene brought me to UCSC in 1980 to teach feminist theory, and her presence infuses all of my life here. This conference to me feels like an extension of all of my life here. It feels like an extension of intense conversations with Helene about a book or paper at Kelly's over good tea and scones, or a dinner at the Women's Center over scrumptious food that Helene organized for feminist faculty from all the divisions to tell each other about our work. Last year, we planned for that kind of food and camaraderie in the flesh, but SARS-CoV-2 had other ideas for how we would reconfigure our social and intellectual worlds in pandemia. Helene would surely laugh with irony and love at our holding her conference on Zoom. I hope the next 2 days are for each of you individually and for all of us together, a deepening of understanding of what writing for living means and why Helene Moglen is so central to so many in that practice. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Aswaswa-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Let me point out a few technical things before we start. On the top right hand of your Zoom screen, you can switch from speaker view to gallery view if you wish. You'll also see three little dots up there. And if your name is unaccountably Blanca Rodriguez, you can click down to rename and put your actual name. This is because Blanca very nicely sent folks a link so that if anyone lost their link at the last minute, they could still join the conference. Okay. Also, I would like you to look at the bottom of your screen. And if any of you would like the help of live transcript of subtitles because of hearing issues, usually extremely good simultaneous live transcription can be had if you click on that live transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom screen and then click on the function that you want. All of this conference is going to be recorded and archived. There will be no Q&A today, but there will be Q&A both tomorrow and both sessions tomorrow. And we invite you to use the chat function and send each other secret messages. I also have put information about the Endowment Fund in the chat function. With generous initial contributions from Sheila Namir and Helene Moglen, an endowment has been established to regularly fund the Helene Moglen Memorial Lecture in Feminism and the Humanities in the coming years. Professor Emerita at Rutgers University, Myra Jalen, Helene's long-term colleague and friend in literature, was to give the first lecture last March, but she could not join us online this year. We miss her. You'll see in the chat function addresses, both online and snail mail, if you wish to make a contribution to the Endowment Fund. This conference is generously sponsored by the Humanities Division and the Siegfried B. and Elizabeth Mignon Puknat Literary Studies Endowment. We are deeply in debt. Many people have made this conference possible, and my gratitude is heartfelt. Carla Frachero and Jennifer Gonzalez were on the organizing committee with me over 2 years, and they did way more than I can acknowledge here. Alison Tassio designed our banner and brochure. Thanks also to help on that from Sarah Friedlander. Staff in the Humanities Division organized twice for very different kinds of conferences in a period of relentless overwork and understaffing. I owe special gratitude to Blanca Rodriguez, the Humanities Dean's Office Administrative Associate, who endured my panics, excessive emails with confusing subject headings, and relentless requests to do work that was never in her job description. I will not forget her hard work and generosity. I also want to thank many more people in the Humanities Division, the Humanities Institute, university events, Information and Technology Services, the Center for Cultural Studies, including Amy Brunage, Judy Plummer, Carrie Napoles, Mayanthi Fernando, Rafferty Lincoln, Irina Polic, Jessica Gill, Diana Hogue, Kristen Palma, Kim Hui, Paulina Fisher, Christian Alvarado, and Angela Fowles. Finally, I'm grateful to our 2 Zoom Corps student workers who will shepherd us through the next 2 days, Jason Kerman and Olivia Curiel. If you have a technical question during the presentations, put it in chat and they will help you. Now it is my extraordinary good fortune and pleasure to introduce Seth Moglin as our first speaker. Helene's youngest son, Seth Moglin, is professor of English, Africana Studies, and American Studies at Lehigh University. Like his mother, Seth believes in the civic mission of the humanities and in the role of literature in facilitating social change. He has published widely on literary modernism, African-American writing, and on working class political movements in the United States. Seth is also the co-founder of the South Side Initiative, a wide-ranging enterprise of democratic university community collaboration in the post-industrial city of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where he lives and teaches. He is now at work on an experimental book called Bethlehem, American Utopia, American Tragedy, which employs modernist literary techniques to explore the 280-year history of the city of Bethlehem, uncovering a rich archive of popular egalitarian thought and practice in one iconic American community. His first play, Hidden Seed, tells the story of Bethlehem's African, Native American, and European female founders, and was produced in 2019 and broadcast on PBS. Like Helene, Seth believes that storytelling can help us live more fully and create more vibrant communities. I would like to ask the Zoom Corps people to please play Seth's presentation, Literature, Multiplicity, and Love, Helene Moglen's Feminist Vision.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Donna Haraway, Carla Frachero, and Jennifer Gonzalez for their many months of labor organizing this conference last spring and for their commitment to holding it online this winter. It's a pleasure to gather with you all at last, however virtually. As some of you know, I'm Helene's youngest son, and because I became a literary critic myself, I also had the good fortune to become her colleague. She was my first and most lasting mentor, and then over time we became collaborators. For 30 years, we edited drafts of one another's work, supported one another through the frustrations of the writing process, celebrated one another's completed articles and books. Despite my familiarity with her scholarship, it was a revelatory experience for me last year during a period of mourning to read writing from across the whole of her career. In every sentence, I could hear her voice and feel her mind at work. As I turned each page, I had the chance to walk with her once more, step by step, through a lifetime's intellectual journey. I was often flooded with images of her from my childhood in the late 60s and early 70s. There she was, sitting in the playground, making dinner, working at her desk, her fingers always stained blue from the ink of her fountain pen. But now, alongside those images, I could hear the words she had been composing every morning before my brothers and I woke to go to school. With such vividness, I could now hear her patient thinking and watch the thrilling moments of discovery. So I offer here tonight a few snapshots from that journey, a sketch of her career. My mother was born in Brooklyn in 1936 and grew up in one of those Jewish families in which the parents' lack of formal education fueled a particular veneration of learning. Her father had to leave school as a boy to go to work, and he communicated to his daughter a fierce pride that she would one day read the books he could not understand. My mother cherished to the end of her life the memory of catching the subway and fleeing Flatbush for the day at the age of 14, clutching her copy of T.S. Eliot's poems and spending the afternoon at the Museum of Modern Art. Nowhere did she feel so much herself as in that temple of art, with lines of poetry running through her mind. At Bryn Mawr, she majored in philosophy and delighted to find herself for the first, but not the last time, in a community of gifted women, some of whom were as eager to talk about books as she was. In the late 1950s, she went on to pursue her PhD in the Yale English department, where the new criticism was contending with an older historicism that fused literary and intellectual history. She was told by one of her teachers that they had admitted women only to keep the male graduate students happy, and another lamented that she must be planning to drop out when her first pregnancy began to show. She was angered but undaunted by this misogyny, and she thrived as a scholar of the English novel. Her first book, The Philosophical Irony of Laurence Sterne, bears the traces of the mid-century Yale English department from which her dissertation sprang. It is an erudite book that places Sterne's fiction into a sustained dialogue with the philosophy of John Locke. Following the procedures of the new criticism, she identifies the aesthetic unity of Sterne's digressive masterpiece, Tristram Shandy, as well as its many modes of irony. But underneath these mid-century critical conventions, something stranger and more wonderful is brewing. She claims that Locke is the intellectual hero of the book, but it is Freud and the broader traditions of psychoanalysis that was actually enabling her to identify what was really at stake for her in Tristram Shandy. She contends that in Laurence Sterne and his protagonists, we encounter discernibly modern subjects, human beings struggling to create themselves as they think and write and talk. They feel themselves to be aliens in their own society. They are vulnerable, struggling to overcome isolation, yearning for intimacy. They try to define themselves and to reach one another through reason. But reason is inadequate, constantly ruptured and exceeded by the intensity of unconscious emotion. Sexual desire, fear of inadequacy, loneliness, the yearning for connection. She celebrates Sterne's eerily modern gift for capturing the multiplicity of the self, a protean self, she calls it, yearning and conflicted, riven by contradiction, only partially conscious of its own fears and desires. In Stern, she finds the precursor to Joyce and Woolf, the creator of the first stream of consciousness novel, which could record the internal conflict of human beings who want to know themselves, but can never do so fully, who find themselves trapped in their own egotism, but struggle perpetually for connection. It is one of the remarkable features of my mother's career that she published her second book, Charlotte Bronte, The Self-Conceived, only 1 year after her book on Lawrence Stern. And in between those two books, a revolution had taken place. The women's movement of the late 60s and 70s, the second wave, changed everything. She brought to the Bronte book the same precision as a reader of literary texts, the same combination of psychological insight and historical rigor, the same philosophical and conceptual ambition. But all of these were now deployed in the service of a collective political project. Her voice as a critic was transformed. One can hear on every page a new boldness and authority, a passionate investment at once personal and political. She set out in the Bronte book to invent a new literary form, the feminist literary biography, not a conventional biography that would heap up factual detail, but an attempt to explore with psychoanalytic precision the development of a feminist consciousness by tracing one woman's evolving struggle to resolve a persistent personal and social challenge across a series of literary texts over decades of artistic production. Bronte's problem was, in her view, like Stern's, how to construct a self. But that problem was now explicitly gendered, and Bronte's struggle, she announced in the introduction, was itself part of a larger multi-generational movement. And here I quote, "The feminist struggle, through which men and women today define themselves both in support and opposition, in our families, in our society, in our political and sexual lives, we are still the victims of the patriarchal forces which protect our economic structures. We continue to reenact our roles in the romantic mythology, which embodies and validates that pervasive power. And as we too strive for autonomous definition, we see ourselves reflected in different aspects of Bronte's struggle." In her view, Bronte believed that a fully realized life requires one be able to love and to be loved, and that the core problem was how to reach that loving state while still maintaining independence. This seemed to be an irresolvable problem for Bronte, as for millions of other women in Victorian England, because she had been socialized to imagine that passionate love in a compulsorily heterosexual society required a woman's submission to and disintegration into the will of a more powerful man. Through a series of brilliant readings of Bronte's childhood writings and 4 mature novels, she explores in intimate detail Bronte's obsession with the male Byronic hero, the masterful male love object, a narcissistic, charismatic, imperious, and demanding father figure. And she traces the struggle of Bronte's fictional heroines to secure intimacy and recognition while retaining the psychic, intellectual, emotional, and bodily integrity that could alone enable them to cultivate a fully realized subjectivity. Charlotte Bronte, The Self-Conceived, ultimately tells a tragic story in which the author and her protagonists cannot achieve this combination of love and personal integrity in a patriarchal society. But the book also tells a story of feminist artistic achievement, as Bronte produced with ever greater refinement an account of a vibrant, self-conscious feminist subject and gestured toward the psychic and social transformations that could enable such women to thrive. Bronte's book is an ambitious work of literary scholarship. It is also, like so many of the pioneering works of the second wave, frankly and movingly personal. As she wrote in her introduction, I have pursued my own shadow through the beckoning recesses of another's mind, hoping to discover its substance at the journey's end. This was the scholar who arrived at UCSC in 1978 as Dean of Humanities and Arts. Over the next 2 decades, even through the years of intense administrative labor, her scholarship flourished and evolved. She produced a stream of feminist writing, some of it institutional and activist, like her co-edited volume on sexual and gender harassment in the academy, some of it personal and political, like her influential essay with Evelyn Fox Keller on the problem of competition among academic women, some of it theoretical, as in the volume she co-edited with Elizabeth Abel and the late Barbara Christian, Female Subjects in Black and White, Race, Psychoanalysis, Feminism. During these years of culture war, when the assault on the humanities was becoming undeniable, she published powerful polemical essays like her trenchant reply to Alan Bloom and Edie Hirsch, Educational Reform as Tragedy and Farce, but also visionary institution-building books affirming the civic mission of the humanities, including one co-edited volume on the future of doctoral studies in English and another on the rights of literacy, which insisted upon universal access to writing instruction as foundational for a democratic society. Then in 2001, my mother published her most ambitious book, in many ways the capstone of her intellectual career, The Trauma of Gender, a feminist theory of the English novel. In this book, she sought to overthrow 2 arguments that had defined her field for 50 years. First, that the English novel had emerged above all as a response to the burgeoning of capitalism and the rise of the middle class. And second, that its dominant mode was realism. My mother insisted that the novel, modernity's most influential form of storytelling, had emerged instead most profoundly in response to the traumatic imposition of the modern binarized sex-gender system. And she argued that novelists from the 18th century onward had created a hybrid form of storytelling in which realist and fantastic fictions contend with one another. From the beginning, realist fictions sought to represent the successful imposition of emergent forms of masculinity and femininity defined as mutually exclusive, and sought to represent the successful achievement of the acquisitive, rational, individualistic male subject bound to women through the marriage plot and through a regime of gender difference and complementarity. But in the fantastic tradition that emerged alongside realism, and in the fantastic subtexts of even the most foundational male-authored works of the realist tradition, 18th century novelists revealed the terrible cost of the intensifying regime of gender difference. Gothic fictions revealed the psychic price paid by women for a sexually segregated social order in which they endure sexual and economic horrors and are compelled to embrace a masochistic mode of desire. These Gothic fictions represent the psychic deformation of male subjects who as anti-heroes are driven by unrestrained egotism, aggression, greed, motivated at once by a misogynistic heterosexuality and a homophobic homosexuality in which intimacy can be experienced only as erotic domination that ends in madness or death. Most importantly, these fantastic fictions, these Gothic narratives, revealed the underlying ineradicable indeterminacy of the self that resisted, refused, and subverted the regime of gender difference. The Trauma of Gender was my mother's most intensively theoretical book, bringing to bear decades of systematic feminist engagement with psychoanalytic theory, but it is characteristic of her career and sensibility that she argued here that literature embodies and enacts what theory can never adequately capture. As she wrote in her conclusion, Theory needs fiction to complete it. Fictions perform their experience of multiplicity, ambiguity, and contradiction in ways that enable identification. They bind us with the threads of their desire, their rage, their joy, their alienation, and their despair. They establish a circuit that connects us through our minds and our senses to the expressive perplexity of their authors. They clear a transitional space for creative collaboration and empathic recognition. I quote this passage because it captures my mother's abiding faith in the power of literature, and more specifically in the power of sharing and discussing literature as a form of play through which we might understand ourselves and one another more fully, and through which we might create a transformed society. As she makes clear in the final pages of The Trauma of Gender, her deepest aim has been to encourage a form of play that will enable more of us to embrace gender indeterminacy, and by so doing to access the empathic gaze and intimacy, saving ourselves from tragic isolation. In summarizing her project, she explains, and I quote, that to read these 18th century novels from a feminist and psychoanalytic perspective is to understand that men and women have struggled within and against the modern sex-gender system for 300 years. They have struggled for more capacious identities and for fuller expressions of their need and ability to love. We join the hopeful, if interminable, effort to transform melancholia to mourning and then to convert mourning to social and psychological change. My mother continued to write until the very end of her life. In the last few years, she was working on several projects. One of these was a book in which she sought to extend into new domains her work on realist and fantastic storytelling. One half of the book, built on an ambitious essay called From Frankenstein to Facebook, which some of you may have heard her deliver as an Emerita lecture at UCSC in 2013. In this remarkable essay, she proposed two ways of narrating the story of the postmodern digital subject. She suggested that like Victor, the scientist protagonist of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, one of the most celebrated of all fantastic fictions, we find ourselves in the 21st century seeking recognition from our own creations. Staring into our computers and smartphones, we, like Victor, indulge the fantasy of our omnipotence, persistently disappointed as we are forced to confront again and again that seemingly unlimited access to information is not the same as knowledge. Social media promises human connection, yet induces a deepening alienation within ourselves and those with whom we might conduct real rather than virtual intimacies. As our machines induce a growing sense of paranoia and narcissistic desperation, we imagine ourselves to be zombies and vampires. But she hastens to point out the realist story that undergirds this fantastic narrative. If corporations grow rich by commodifying our yearning for intimacy, and as Edward Snowden revealed, the state exploits our insecurities in order to maximize social control in ways that imperil the space of privacy on which both self-reflection and intimacy depend. At the end of this fiercely critical essay, my mother returns to Mary Shelley's masterpiece, urging us to recognize in the monster himself the humanist hero of the tale, for it is he, not the master scientist, who reflects on his loneliness, who loves nature, joyfully acquires language, yearns for empathic and reciprocal human connection, invents the story of his own past, and reminds us in all these ways of the enduring power of the humanities to create that Winnicottian transitional space of play, of creativity, mutual recognition, and sensuous intimacy. The other half of this final unfinished book builds on one of my mother's most personal and most psychoanalytically trenchant essays, Aging and Trans-Aging, which was first published in Bodies in the Making, a book she edited with Nancy Chen, and which grew out of a conference they organized at UCSC through the Institute for Advanced Feminist Research. I'll speak only briefly about this essay, as I know my mother's beloved partner, Sheila Namir, intends to read from it later today. For now, I will say that in this essay, my mother explored her own experience of aging. And in the very last pages that she sent to me to read in the weeks immediately before her death, she was reflecting specifically on the meaning of writing for one entering advanced old age. In the Trans-Aging essay, she proposed that as each of us ages, we become palimpsests of all the selves that we have been from childhood onward. She acknowledges the painful, traumatic aspects of the aging process, that as we lose the strength and capacity of youth, our aging bodies undermine the illusion of psychic coherence and integrity. And each of us must wrestle with the fantasy of an authentic younger self trapped inside an unreal, decaying body. She explores the temptation in our technologically advanced society of seeking, through cosmetic surgery and other ruses, to restore the illusion of coherence, to restore the aging body, to remembered youth. But she regards this as a melancholic obsession with the ghost of youth and as a refusal of growth and change. In this late essay, she affirms, as she had in everything she wrote, from her Stern and Bronte books onward, that the real prize is to be found in embracing the multiplicity of the self. Its self-acceptance, like creativity, lies in the capacity to feel like oneself while being many. She explains, and here I quote at some length, aging need not be seen as the catastrophe of a moment. It takes place across a lifetime that begins with conception and ends with death. It is a multiple, ambiguous, and contradictory process, which provides us continuously and simultaneously with images of past, present, lost, embodied, and imagined selves. In shifting configuration, these images comprise the discontinuous yet persistent thread of our identities. It is possible to see in this version of the aging self an accretion and layering of innumerable selves, a compilation that is subject to endless subterranean revision. Former moods, affects, thoughts, and states of being, which are embedded in personal history, are never completely erased, but remain psychically available for elaboration and conversion. So the omnivorously desiring infant inhabits the body of the lover. The grandmother, who plays peekaboo with the baby, rediscovers her own infantile delight. The scholar's research is catalyzed by the tantalized voyeurism of the child. I leave you then with these words, which will, I hope, bring pleasure to many of you as they do to me, a reminder of the spirit and voice of a beloved colleague, friend, teacher, mentor, community builder, thinker, writer. Across a long writing life, she explored many subjects. Her journey carried her to many places. But through it all, from the girl clutching a book of poems on the subway to a scholar in her final days, she cultivated always a love of literature and a faith that by sharing it with one another, we might embrace our own multiplicities and find our own idiosyncratic paths to love. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. That was very moving and very deep. much appreciated. It's also my honor and pleasure now to introduce my colleague and friend, person whom I share a birthday, Bettina Aptheker, Distinguished Professor Emerita of Feminist Studies at UCSC. Bettina Aptheker is also the author of numerous influential books, including Tapestries of Life, The Morning Breaks, The Trial of Angela Davis, and a memoir, Intimate Politics. Her deep and wide activism, teaching, and scholarship have shaped feminist studies at UCSC for over 4 decades. Bettina worked in tandem with Helene Moglen for more than 20 years in establishing and sustaining the Women's Studies program between 1979 and the early 2000s. In 2012, with Karen Yamashita, she was appointed to the UC Presidential Chair in Feminist Critical Studies, in Feminist Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. Currently, she holds the Baskin Foundation UC Presidential Chair for Feminist Studies. Bettina's work includes African American feminist history, queer feminist historiography, and a broad range of feminist issues from an anti-racist intersectional approach, including sexual violence, reproductive justice, indigenous sovereignty, and environmental justice. Her online course, Feminism and Social Justice, launched in March 2019 on the Coursera platform, has already engaged nearly 63,000 students in its global reach and remains ongoing. She is currently writing a book, Communists in Closets, Queering the History 1930s through the 1990s, to be published by Routledge. It's my honor to invite Bettina to speak on establishing women's studies, the early years.
Thank you so much, Donna. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here with everyone. And Seth, I wanted to tell you, I was moved to tears by your beautiful, beautiful presentation. Thank you so much. I want to thank Donna and everyone and all of the colleagues for their work in putting together this 2-day conference. And I want to thank you for inviting me to participate. And a very warm embrace to all of Helene's family, and especially to Sheila right now. I came to UCSC as a graduate student in History of Consciousness program in 1979. Helene had arrived the year before to become Dean of Humanities and Provost of Kresge College. Helene was the first woman dean of any faculty in the UC system. In the late 1970s, the campus was small with about 5,000 students and only 5 colleges, and with a mandate for innovation. Under these auspices and auspicious conditions, Women's Studies was founded in the mid-1970s by students who were passionate partisans of the women's liberation movement and their faculty allies who cemented the administrative protocols with the appropriate committees of the academic senate. Unlike many other institutions in the country, the program here was designated as a student major from its inception in the 1974-75 academic year. It was run by a student collective. Its courses were taught by some of those undergraduate students in what were called student-directed seminars with faculty supervision. The regular curriculum was taught by very generous faculty from a range of departments in the humanities and social sciences. They received no compensation or departmental recognition. In fact, they got a lot of blowback for it for their work, but they did it anyhow out of their feminist commitments. Shortly after I settled into HISCON, I learned about the founding of Women's Studies and then the way in which its governance had been changed by Helene in her first year as dean. Instead of a student-run collective, she insisted that faculty be in charge of the Women's Studies program, with students in a supportive but less commanding role. She did this because with her institutional wisdom, she knew that the program would not survive unless faculty were in charge and invested in sustaining it. I first met Helene when I arrived in that fall of 1979, and I was mostly, as I recall it, more than a little bewildered and in awe of this woman who was our dean. I met with her more formally a few months later when she approved my hire as a lecturer in women's studies in the 80-81 academic year, even though I was still a graduate student. However, I did have a master's degree from San Jose State, where I'd been teaching since 1976. That year, I took over teaching what was then called Introduction to Women's Studies. I changed its name to Introduction to Feminism. That first quarter I taught it, all the students were activists in the women's movement. We had about 35, and I remember it with great joy. The following year, when I taught it, we had 100 students, and then it just sort of escalated after that. And then Helene approved me for a short period of time to be chair of Women's Studies program because we didn't have anybody else, and I was still a graduate student. And I thought she was being very innovative and very, very generous to me. I was added to the Women's Studies Executive Committee, in which faculty held the decision-making power, and a cohort of active students remained. It was in this way that we all worked together to build the program. Within a few years, we had 114 majors and no permanent faculty, since as a program we were not permitted to hire our own tenure-track positions. And it was in this situation that compelled us to move through whatever administrative hoops there were to become a regular board of study. In those days, a board of study was the equivalent of a department. Helene left the dean's position after a 5-year stint, joined the faculty full-time in the literature department, and became chair of Women's Studies. We worked in tandem with our executive committee to move us forward toward board status. We were also able to hire a full-time staff person to run the day-to-day work of the program, and that was Nicolette Zaranchik, who I understand is here today. And she took the position. She was terrific. She was a terrific addition to our small everyday contingent, and Nicolette brought great stability to the program and quickly established herself as the vital link between students and faculty and among faculty across the campus. Helene moved forward with our strategy to become a board of study. She wrote a long, scholarly, impassioned paper in support of women's studies as a new field that should be allowed to become a department and receive permanent faculty and funding. This was a complicated intellectual task that involved no small amount of invention. She argued that sex, by which we meant gender, was a definitive category of study. She surveyed many of the disciplines to show the resulting intellectual and scholarly poverty and distortions that resulted from its absence or erasure. Although Helene was the document's principal architect, we all contributed to it. Helene then secured a meeting with a reluctant executive vice chancellor to discuss the status of women's studies and sent him the paper we had written. She also informed him that she would be accompanied by several women faculty, myself included. Shortly before our meeting with the EVC, we learned that some colleagues that he was all aflutter about it, announcing that the, quote, Amazons were coming, close quote, and he recruited a group of male administrators insisting that they come to the meeting, I suppose to protect him. When we arrived in the relatively small conference room, we women were seated at a table with the EVC and then surrounded by his male cohort, who were all standing. When Helene suggested it would be more comfortable if we moved to a larger conference room so everyone could be comfortably seated, the EVC demurred, and so the meeting commenced. The EVC had not read the paper over which we had all labored with such great care, especially Helene. He made it clear he had no intention of reading it and had no intention of ever granting board status to women's studies. When Helene tried to speak, he cut her off. Shortly thereafter, he got up and left the room, and the men followed. Helene was shocked, as we all were, but I think she was shocked not only by his dismissal of women's studies, but by the lack of even a modicum of collegiality and civility. We women all sat there for a few minutes, and then Helene said, well, okay, we'll do it some other way. And this we did. We got all 60 of the women who then taught at UCSC, many of them lecturers, and others tenured or in tenure-track positions, to sign a letter urging that women's studies become a board of study. And 2,000 students signed a petition to the same effect and actually organized a rally and marched to the chancellor's office, which at that time was housed at McHenry Library. I don't know what happened to that EVC, but I do know that Karl Piester, who was the outgoing chancellor in 1987, changed our status from a program to that of what he called a committee. I said to Helene, "What is a committee?" I had never heard of such a thing. Helene said, "I don't know, they made it up, but we can hire our own faculty." And so it came to pass that I was hired in the first tenure-track position in women's studies that fall. Once Helene had put her foot in the door, we persevered and shoved it open as wide as we could. By the early 1990s, we had hired some of the most extraordinary colleagues in the field, including Akasha Hull, an authority on African American literature, Emily Honig, who was a scholar in modern Chinese women's history, and Wendy Brown, a political scientist who had done her undergraduate work at UCSC and gone on to the beginnings at that time of what was clearly going to be a brilliant career. We continued with Helene as chair and our executive committee, now energized with new faculty permanently lodged in women's studies. Despite various obstacles and resistance, and it took a while, we finally became a full-fledged department in 1996. Meanwhile, on another front, in the early 80s, Helene, ever innovative and energetic, heard that Cardiff House at the base of the UCSC campus had been recently renovated and would become available for programmatic use. I don't know all of the details about what she did, but what I do know is that she claimed it for a women's center and convinced whoever had to be convinced that this was the building's destiny. This beautiful building with its large interior, complete with a kitchen and separate rooms for offices and meetings, and with its spacious lawns in front and back, became the center for activist work that linked up with the feminist and lesbian communities. Creating a board consisting of faculty, students, and community activists, campus and town came together. This was Helene's vision. The board determined the center's broad policies, and an executive director was hired to run it. The first director was the remarkable Chicana lesbian feminist visionary Beatriz Lopez Flores. Then in the early 1990s, Helene launched what was called the Feminist Research Initiative, or FRI, a unique intellectual space in which feminist faculty and graduate students worked together. We held day-long conferences periodically during the academic year. Faculty and graduate students working together presented their scholarly works in progress in a relaxed and supportive milieu. The FRI was an intellectual haven for several years, and the day-long sessions were scheduled to allow time for food and collegial conviviality. Of course, the FRI met at the Women's Center, and over the years, our Women's Studies annual celebration for graduating seniors was also held at the Women's Center. Helene's vision for this kind of feminist community floundered as funding for FRI was cut and eventually ended, and she went on to do other initiatives of a similar kind. At about the same time, women's studies itself was growing, and a new generation of scholars was changing its intellectual and theoretical parameters. By the very early 2000s, we recruited enough new faculty in women's studies to make for what might be called a critical mass. This resulted in the dissolution of the executive committee and the establishment of a more regular departmental structure. With the change in structure, we ended most of the affiliated faculty participating in the governance of the department. And Helene's role inside the department, which had been so critical for 20 years, ended. I know that the severance was very painful for her, and I regret that it was not pursued in a more thoughtful and compassionate way. She had given everything to creating the department. However, I am so honored to participate in this conference today, and I can say with absolute certainty that without Helene Moglen, our thriving feminist studies department, now comprising 11 faculty and with its own graduate program, would not exist. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bettina. That's very moving and brings so much back. It's now my pleasure and honor to introduce my friend, somebody Helene gave me. I feel friend and colleague Sheila Namir, also Helene's spouse. Sheila Namir earned her two PhDs, one in clinical psychology from UC Berkeley, and the other in psychoanalysis from the Southern California Psychoanalytic Institute. She served on the faculty of the UCLA School of Medicine, as well as two psychoanalytic institutes in Los Angeles and the California School of Professional Psychology. Sheila has extensive experience working with patients with life-threatening and chronic illnesses, early trauma, PTSD, mood disorders, and other areas. She co-taught writing for veterans in Santa Cruz with her spouse, Helene Moglen. Sheila's many scholarly articles include embodiments and disembodiments, relation of body modifications to two psychoanalytic treatments. And with Helene, she co-authored 3 papers, War and the Dis-eases of Othering, Leaving Analysis and Moving Beyond Pain, and Fighting for Words, a creative writing workshop for veterans. Sheila lived in no fewer than 5 different countries besides the country of Los Angeles for nearly 30 years before meeting Helene and moving and anchoring in Santa Cruz. She's written a novel, unpublished, and many volumes of poetry, unpublished by choice. So much of Helene's writing, too, remains in her morning notebooks in which she wrote daily. Writing for living is not the same thing as publishing, an important point in academia. Sheila Namir will speak on writing to live. Sheila.
Thank you, Donna. Very kind. First, I want to thank the organizing committee, Donna, Carla, and Jennifer, who worked amazingly hard for the second time to make this conference such a meaningful event to honor Helene. I especially want to thank Donna for her unbelievable organization, efforts, and graciousness in doing the work, acts of deep friendship and love. I also want to thank Bettina, Leslie, and Susan for their honoring of Helene with their words and intellectual work, as well as the wonderful and engaged discussants tomorrow. A very special thank you to Brenda, whose poems Helene and I have read and loved for years. This short talk is about my personal experience of living with Helene and witnessing, participating, and sharing Writing to Live. First, I will read part of a piece she was working on in the months before her death, as Seth mentioned in his talk, for the introduction to the book she was trying to complete. I quote, "Writing about late life requires a late style that resonates with the ambiguities and contradictions of aging. We decline as we grow old, of course, but we can also flourish. As memory fails, reflections deepen. Banked fires glow before charcoal falls to ash. We write about ourselves in late life in order to make our worlds intelligible to ourselves. We struggle to identify our dominant narratives with which minor narratives can merge. We also write in order to imagine, inquiring so we are able to invent. Throughout our lives, we create ourselves in language, making and remaking consciousness with words. Our stories provide scaffolding for our identities and expose yearnings that inflect developmental scripts. Now, as I write my own account of aging, I struggle to separate images from impressions and meanings from mood. I am spectator and spectacle simultaneously, embedded in a process I seek to understand. Memory wanes as the importance of memories intensifies. After our initial meeting and conversations during a weekend University of California Psychoanalytic Consortium at Lake Arrowhead, and predictably, our intense conversations were about writing, reading, feminist psychoanalysis, and death. Ours became an epistolary relationship as we discovered each other and fell in love. Helene saved the hundreds of emails we sent to each other for the 2 months before I came to Santa Cruz to visit her. In a letter to me, February 14th, 2002, she described the epistolary beginning of our love affair. Quote, as so often for me, writing is a practice for living, for becoming, for being. This is why I have written to you so little in the months that I have been with you and for you. Practice has been the experience itself. She felt that our voluminous email exchanges in the 2 months before we met in person again were, quote, the desire for a response, which always came, which accepted mine, acknowledged it, enabled me to continue to discover what I knew, what I felt, who I was becoming. That pretty well sums up what writing meant to Helene. A way of knowing, recognizing, revealing, and understanding oneself and others more deeply. Reading mattered to Helene, and she read and reread her personal canon of beloved writers many times. Writing mattered to Helene, and she wrote almost every day. She didn't write on my birthday, though she had written a poem for each birthday except the last. Or she didn't write when her grandchildren were visiting. Helene wrote letters, emails, obituaries, editorials, fiction, essays, books, journals, and poetry with equal care. She was writing a novel before she died about loss, and also another book about her major ideas over the course of a lifetime, which Seth has described so beautifully earlier in his talk. She would wake in the morning, make her breakfast, take it to her desk, and begin answering emails. She would then edit and revise the writing she had done the day before. Finally, she would begin writing on that day's, week's, or year's project. Often she would end up saying that she thought the first draft of a piece was better than the 3 or 4 that followed, that it was clearer and less convoluted. Helene, without a writing project, was discontented, frustrated, and searching. It was, however, the process, not the product, that gave her joy and satisfaction. She wanted the writing to be good, each word carefully chosen, and as I indicated, revised even her journals, although she intended them to be burned after her death. She wrote slowly as she sought the perfect sentence. Helene found herself by writing. After a debilitating flu, one afternoon, she came out of her study and told me with joy, I feel back to myself. Her writing that morning had pleased her. That is what Helene's love of writing was about, finding one's voice, thoughts, feelings, and expressing them well. She wrote to work out a problem, to know what she felt or thought, to communicate with others, but mainly she wrote for herself. It was her practice, as determined as any spiritual or physical practice. She would never even agree to give a paper at a conference unless she had already written it. Her motivation was intrinsic, not extrinsic. Helene also passionately enjoyed conversing with others, as many of you experienced. Words and ideas mattered to her in all forms. If anyone in conversation with her had a thought, an idea, a theory, or a question, Helene would say, why don't you write about that? It would make an interesting paper. Her own enthusiastic conversations with others often led to more writing. She encouraged everyone to write, and she was a fierce editor. Those of us who have received her astute and extensive editing often felt worn out, dismayed, but finally appreciative of her commitment and efforts to make our work better. She was particularly determined to help me stop writing in a social sciencey way, in her words, and allow me to discover my own voice, my own flow. Helene was thrilled by writing well and was always in search of writing that perfect sentence one day. I remember one of the mornings shortly before she died, when she was struggling with that morning's writing. Finally, she came out of her study, aglow with pleasure. She had reread her poems and liked most of them. Helene's writing was also as activism. In addition to essays on sexual harassment, literacy and education, misogyny, race, and war, she wrote long letters to administrators at the university, to people whom she believed should be doing more to make our lives and world better, and to people whose behavior she abhorred or thought wrong. When she was angry or hurt, she wrote. When she was happy and pleased, she wrote. When she was confused or troubled, she wrote. She wrote by hand, with many different fountain pens, in notebooks and on paper. And as many of you know, colors thrilled Helene, and she had pens with turquoise, green, magenta, and other colored ink. When transferring her writing to the computer, she would peck with 2 fingers, having never learned to type. When I first met Helene, she didn't consider herself a writer. That appellation was reserved for her husband, Sig. I read The Trauma of Gender, which she gave me when I left the UC consortium, in one Sunday afternoon before I was coming to see her in Santa Cruz. I kept wondering, how does she know all of this? Particularly her reading of the novels as intrapsychic and interpsychic. Her deep understanding of regression, trauma, and other psychological phenomena. When I asked her, she replied, I learned it as I read and taught the novels, and I found my way to knowing as I wrote. One of the first gifts I gave her was a leather-bound journal. She cried and told me she was moved because, quote, you see me as a writer. We wrote 3 papers together, so I am intimately aware of her writing process. These were challenging experiences because our writing styles were very different, but we persevered to help each other articulate our thinking, hone our expression of feelings, and appreciate our writing by recognizing each other's differences. Of course, I learned a great deal from Helene about writing, editing, and presenting a coherent narrative. I also discovered more about what writing meant to Helene, as illuminated by several passages from our joint paper, Fighting for Words, in 2015. Helene wrote, silence is a stone, a thing that cannot be chewed, swallowed, digested, or transformed. It is telling the story of trauma that enables the flow of memory and makes reparation possible. Silenced, grief becomes anger. Remorse becomes rage. Narrative transforms involuntary remembering. It ends silence and gives language to unbearable affect. The community listens and the self begins to hear itself speaking. In that paper, Helene wrote about why creative writing was an important vehicle for these veterans and for herself. Writing becomes a vehicle for hope, that pain and absence can be transformed in the presence of a trustworthy community of listeners who make alienated experience communal. We offered writing groups to veterans over a 6-year period. The participants read their written reactions to prompts we gave them the week before, and group members listened and responded. After each group session, Helene spent hours responding and writing to their papers. Often her comments, her conversations with the writers were as long as the pieces they had presented in the class. She was not trying to edit their work, to correct their grammar or punctuation. She was in dialogue with them, receiving and recognizing their words, thoughts, and feelings. As Benjamin Moser wrote in his biography of Susan Sontag, literature gave life, and when life departed, literature preserves its memory. I have, I believe, most of Helene's writing, and I read it often during my months of mourning. To hear her voice, to feel her presence, to remember all that mattered to her, to continue to learn from her, and to continue holding her in my mind and heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That brings Helene so powerfully into this celebration and consideration of her work and her living and her writing. And I feel that Seth, Bettina, Sheila, and now Brenda together bring Helene into this gathering of 120 people celebrating and thinking and feeling with Helene. Brenda Shaughnessy was born in Okinawa, Japan, and grew up in Southern California before attending UCSC, a smart move, where she was a women's studies and literature major. She was a literature student of Helene Moglen in the early 1990s, before moving to New York City to write poetry and attend graduate school at Columbia University. Shaughnessy is the author of 5 amazing books of poetry, the recipient of a 2013 Guggenheim Fellowship and a 2018 Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and she is a professor of English at Rutgers University in Newark. She lives in New Jersey with her family and is daily grateful for the mentorship of her feminist professors at Santa Cruz, Bettina Aptheker, Wendy Brown, she names me, Carla Pachero, Tilly Shaw, and Helene Moglen. These thinkers and educators showed a very uncertain young woman how to find her voice. They modeled the ways that Shaughnessy now uses to mentor the next generation of women writers, writers of color, poets, and multi-genre makers at Rutgers. Brenda will be reading poetry that she wrote specifically for Helene, and I turn it over to you, Brenda.
Hello, everyone. Am I audible? All right. I am moved to tears a number of times already. Hello, I'm coming to you on Lenni Lenape land in New Jersey. I want to thank the conference committee, especially Donna Haraway, Carla Pachero, and Jennifer Gonzalez for inviting me to speak at this gathering honoring Helene. Thank you to Sheila for your loving and luminous words. The piece I'm about to read spans about 30 years and is patchy like memory and fragmented as poetry can be by design, and is wordy at times like scholarship often is. I do not attempt to span Helene's influence or cultural contributions. I know her work deepened and expanded far beyond the texts and teachings I mentioned in this piece, which is grounded in the ancient times of 1991 to 1993. I only wanted to show what it has been like to be guided by her light, what an adventure it was and is. There are 2 quotations in this piece. One is a quote from my own poem, Post-Feminism, which back then was something we thought might one day be a thing. And one is a longer passage from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. I'll indicate these quotations with this annoying gesture. Finally, the piece is in 10 sections. 10, the number of weeks in a UC Santa Cruz quarter. And the whole thing should run about 14 minutes long, excluding this 90-second intro I have now concluded. This is coursework for Helene. 1, for bodies, for the feelings flowing between bodies, Is it time or space that is most like mind? Time to be together. Together, time tethers us to longer longing. The space between coasts lived through like cats in heat. A TV set on staying on. Farewell to the future's favorite fruit, all turned to juice. We were fine right where we were when I was run from home, free from fire. I forgot you lit deep and holy strong. I was feral in the forest, left behind a carbon of us to walk through woods on foot, in print to read later. Number 2. 30 years ago, you taught me that books can become the beginning of a self, combine with a life in progress to make a parallel story lived alongside, inside books. That reading could mix with experience, making life after life after life inside a solid simultaneous self. You would lead me to that place books always promised, where anything could happen, but it was a matter of context, place and time and body and politics, the analysis of which was a mix of judgment and soul, of egos and logos and trust that everything that happened in books happened inside us. Once we got it straight, that what should happen in books echoed and sang with what we wanted to happen in life, a fair shot for women and girls, a path from past racism to futureless racism, and how to see the forest for the trees we walked through on our way to class, late, but not too late, only 10 minutes past 30 years later. Maybe too late for the trees, now pages for the voice, the story with momentum older than fundament, and twice alive. These lives of the women we were, and the way our art and books stacked up to look like freedom of thought. And was it not? 3. Helene had a map of the forest in which were hidden an unknown number of paths leading to the place where the key to the self was hidden. The key to the doors of the self, which might or might not be hidden or might not exist. Might not be the right doors to what might not be the right self, or the right path, or the map itself was hidden safely inside the self itself. Years to find it, decades to find it, a journey folded up and saved and carried, carefully underlined. 4. Didn't everything become once you said it out loud? A student in our class once said out loud, I left the theater after a movie and caught a glimpse of someone in the mirror I didn't recognize as myself. And Helene, you said in reply, yes, you look at a sunset and find that you are weeping. It was a suddenly recurring moment we were all stunned to recognize that it was only at this moment we recognized all the ways we did not recognize ourselves until that moment, when we knew we saw ourselves and knew we were each other. And hidden in this clarity was our new knowledge that emotions were sensory. That is, emotions had a way in and out of the body through senses, and that reading cracked our glass covering and fit the tip to our senses through which our bodies learned to read. That my inner feelings and thoughts could be touched, contacted, radioed by the outside world, and that I could transmit my own inner reality to the outside world if I made a material sensory object to carry them out. Writing, art, music, those were the ways, the work, the course of the vessels. I had to know how that work worked, how that way was made, so I could learn to make it myself. And reading with Helene was how I would begin or continue to go deeper, serious, way out of my depth. I became a writer by becoming a reader. This fact lifted confusion clear out of the page. 5. We were in a graduate literature seminar I didn't belong in. Wendy talked you into admitting me against your better judgment. You knew I wasn't ready. I never did get ready. But I was pinkish, ambitious, and you could see how much I wanted to become a serious reader worth the work. That it was already a miracle I had found a way to the desire to possess a serious mind of my own, that I could go deep into reading and find the world there, the mirror page refracted through my own weak light. 6, I'm speaking of the past, and of what passed back then as past. We thought you had to already know something before you could begin to learn it. Like having to speak a new language so the swim coach knows you're fast. So many things like that. So many Olympics before you ever opened your mouth. Pre-learning. But pre-learning was all desire. Whatever you wanted. Polymorphous. Books prepared you for other books. I told Helene I only wanted to read books by women. That should tell you where I was at back then. And Helene disapproved and pushed Henry James on me, a small one, turn of the screw, and I opened my mind to not just psychological torment as metaphor for attachment and projection, but that book kept me from reframing the world in the name of only ever feminism, to resist the lure of totalizing every book just to feel power over it. 7, Donna, you taught me books were 7-dimensional. Text, supporting text, length, width, time, energy, belief. Bettina, you taught me that to become a woman, I would need to seriously grow up, to see ordinary days as heart-stopping continual historical facts. Wendy, you taught me personhood was powerful and not a given. It had to be continually rewritten in ever stronger language, deeper ink. Helene, you made books live inside me, like parasites or worms dangerously close to my heart, ever after a book heart. Deceiving, digesting, discovered continually. Villette is Charlotte's best book. Beloved is America's most necessary and visionary book. Mrs. Dalloway showed the gendered split between two worlds. I wrote a poem called Post-Feminism, which begins, there are two kinds of people, soldiers and women, as Virginia Woolf said, both for decoration only. To whom was I writing if not you, my teachers, to show you that your teaching took, that what you taught caught, released back into the current as writing, as talk. 8, it wasn't easy to get to Helene's 10 a.m. class on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The bus station was always so crowded with people going up to campus, you couldn't squeeze onto the first or the second bus. You had to wait for a third. And if you tried to catch a bus further along the route, they'd all pass you without stopping, overloaded. I finally got on a bus and tried to use my ride to finish the reading for class. I was behind, as usual. I lingered over Mrs. Dalloway so long I often forgot where I was. I didn't have a seat, jostled between the patchouli and hummus bodies. Almost crushed, I found the passage in Woolf that opened my life and changed my cells and flung my funny, underused little heart straight into love's and literature's fire. Literature was love and love was lit. Then came the most exquisite moment of her whole life, passing a stone urn with flowers in it. Sally stopped, picked a flower, kissed her on the lips. The whole world might have turned upside down. The others disappeared. There she was, alone with Sally. And she felt that she had been given a present, wrapped up and just told just to keep it, not to look at it. A diamond, something infinitely precious, wrapped up, which as they walked up and down, she uncovered, or the radiance burned through, the revelation, the religious feeling. How did Woolf know when she wrote that I was in love too, with that? Everything in my life came after that moment in which it was clear that Clarissa loved Sally Seton. Years later in New York, I would love a woman named Sally for that reason alone. That should tell you where I was at back then. It was the most romantic thing I'd ever read. I loved it down to the syntax, to the parataxis. I studied it obsessively like you would a lover's pinky second knuckle. Those semicolons. It was not for marriage, it was not for show, not for experience or learning to suppress your wants. It was not what someone else wanted from me, it was what I wanted. And that was so new, it was life-altering. Hallucinogenic. The drugless derangement, this love, all I wanted was for it to continue. Woolf killed herself eventually. Is that what love did? But there was Helene, alive, showing us too what love did, how it helps us live. And live I did for love. I lived for lit and for love. It was Sally, not Clarissa, I longed to be when I wasn't afraid. Sally, who let the rain ruin borrowed books. Wolf spoke through Helene when Helene spoke of Wolf, and worked the ontological question. Who was Clarissa? Who was Septimus? Who were we as bodies and minds? How could we sleep at night? Who were we as a species that we would lose so much to hate and fear and despair? And who were we as people to love each other the way we still do, the way we still yearn to? 9. I still have all the books we read for your classes. After leaving California, I kept your books close, always on my best shelves at eye level. Through 13 moves in 20 New York years, I think of them as your books. Their spines encoded mine. The Bonds of Love, for example, taught me about transference, which I was always having heavily. You showed me how I could counter it in my own teaching future by countering mine then. Nobody ever taught future teachers how to do that. How to handle the boundary-seeking, desperate love so achy and misdirected of a student for a teacher. Of course, it's erotic love. Reading is erotic, sharing language, bodies, and minds across time and space. Helene alone tended the boundary as she would a border of flowers others trampled or picked. 10. I must have fallen in love in that classroom 15 times. With classmates, with the teacher, with the authors, their characters' metaphors. What else is a metaphor? What better way to learn than through love? With a woman you could trust to keep love moving around the room, like music, like we were the music. A chorus of private readers rising on waves of words and voice and following the lines and rolling in the meaning and noting all the beauty and falling in love all before turning the page again and again and next week again and again on Tuesday. Literature snapped into place the way flowers know how to attract. A story was a lived theory, a template, a windbreak, an immortal lived theory as the story continues, all echo and breath. This chain of life is made of letters. The writer writes to the reader. Coursework is the letter written back to the writer. Then the writer writes again, another book, a response, it seems, to our class discussion. We read deeper into it. The author is dead, but we imagine she's exchanging letters with us. The readers of the future, reading ahead, catching up. In this way, the writing lives on. The author was you, Helene. You wrote so much of me, pre-wrote what came to be. I'm writing back to you, although you can't hear me in sense and self. It's still a back and forth, across time and space, still a take and give. I'm writing back to you who taught me to live. Thank you.
Brenda, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. That poem brings things together with such power and depth. I feel deeply moved by what's happened this afternoon, and I hope that this is true for all of us. And I hope to see all of us and some new people. I know everybody can't make both days, but we will regather tomorrow. We will start sharp at 11:30. Carla is even more of a master of time than I am. And we will begin at 11:30 tomorrow morning, and we will go for an hour and a half, maybe a tiny bit more, then take a 20-minute break, and then reconvene at 12:50. So I welcome everybody to join us again tomorrow. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything that you gave us today.